Ben ritrovati al CICAP Fest. È arrivato il momento di parlare con il professor Michael Mann, che è qui con noi, climatologo, geofisico, è una delle figure più importanti del dibattito sul cambiamento climatico ed è impegnato da anni a contrastare la disinformazione che poi si è diffusa nei vari media e non solo. Ha contribuito a redigere il lavoro dell'IPCC e ha ricevuto numerosi premi durante la sua lunga carriera e nel 2020 è stato eletto anche alla National Academy of Science negli Stati Uniti. Benvenuto al CICAP, Dr. Mann. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
In queste ultime settimane, mesi, l'IPCC ha rilasciato tutte e tre le relazioni del sesto rapporto di valutazione. Si tratta della raccolta più completa della letteratura scientifica sullo studio dei cambiamenti climatici, migliaia di pagine, centinaia di studi e commenti peer review. Probabilmente è una delle cooperazioni più importanti tra gli scienziati in tutta la storia dell'umanità. Quali sono secondo lei i messaggi principali che è importante sottolineare?
Yeah, thanks. The IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been producing these reports now for more than 2 decades, and in fact now more than 3 decades. The first report was back in 1990, and they reflect an effort by the entire scientific community globally, operating under the auspices of the United Nations, to assess the state of our understanding about the science of climate change, that's the Working Group 1 report, the impacts of climate change, that's the Working Group 2 report, and solutions, mitigation, what we can do, that's the Working Group 3 report, and that's the one that just came out the other day. And if I were to summarize the message of this latest report, and over the last 3 decades, as the IPCC has continued to put out these reports, they have struck an increasingly, I would say, a concerned tone, a greater and greater level of concern that is conveyed with each new report. And now we've reached the point where the scientists who are conservative, this is a conservative body. Scientists don't tend to be shrill. They tend to be very measured in their tone and very conservative in how they speak and how they write. And yet this latest report really strikes a stark tone, communicating very clearly that we now have a crisis on our hands. Climate change has now reached crisis proportions because we haven't seen the action that we would have liked to have seen in response to the past 30 years of IPCC reports. We've been sounding the alarm for 30 years, and yet we haven't seen the action on the part of politicians, policymakers, the nations of the world. We haven't seen the action necessary to avert catastrophic climate impacts. And so we're starting to see those impacts, and this latest report makes very clear that we are not yet on a path to stabilize warming below truly catastrophic levels, below 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're getting very close to potentially irreversible impacts of climate change. So I would say this latest report comes as close as you will ever see to scientists climbing the tallest buildings and screaming at the top of their lungs. That is the nature of the message that we're now hearing from the world scientists.
In questi ultimi anni, almeno nell'ultima decina, la scienza dei cambiamenti climatici ha fatto enormi passi da gigante. Abbiamo scenari migliori sui diversi percorsi legati alle emissioni di CO2 e alle temperature, all'aumento delle temperature. Abbiamo una conoscenza migliori sugli effetti e sui collegamenti con gli eventi estremi, e sappiamo anche che abbiamo le soluzioni per mitigare i cambiamenti climatici e che possiamo utilizzarle immediatamente. Secondo lei la scienza del clima può migliorare ancora nel prossimo futuro, darci previsioni migliori, scenari migliori, o avremo modelli sempre più affidabili?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, the science tells us a few things that relate to, this question. As you note, we as a community have become more sophisticated now in our ability to attribute specific events to climate change. It used to be, 15 years ago, if you asked a climate scientist about, the latest unprecedented extreme weather event, they would say something like, well, we can never relate any one event to climate change. They would have said something fairly dismissive. I sometimes joke, it's like we all took bad communication 101 in college, because that's a poor way of addressing the question. The reality is, and the science now allows us to specifically attribute climate change to these extreme weather events. We can show, for example, that the floods and wildfires that you've seen in Italy, similar events that we've seen in the United States, events that I witnessed when I was on sabbatical down in Australia 2 years ago with the unprecedented bushfires that spread out across the continent. We can now, using climate models, conclude that these sorts of events would have been extremely unlikely in the absence of the warming of the planet from human-caused carbon pollution from fossil fuel burning. And when we include in the models the human effect of increasing levels of carbon dioxide pollution, then we see that these events are far more frequent. And so we can actually conclude that climate change is making events that would have essentially been impossible in the past now happen in the real world. There's also another aspect to the developments of the science, and you alluded to this as well, I think. The science has come a long way now in our ability to determine how our emissions translate to the warming of the planet. And one of the key developments, really over the past decade or so, has been an understanding that if we stop putting carbon pollution into the atmosphere, then surface temperatures on the planet stabilize very quickly. We used to think that if we stopped burning fossil fuels, that the planet would warm up for several more decades due to what we call the thermal inertia of the oceans. The oceans are very sluggish. They continue to warm up even after we stop adding carbon pollution. But as we model the climate system more comprehensively, we now account for another important effect, which is that the oceans continue to pull carbon pollution out of the atmosphere. So it's sort of like the water level in your sink. If you turn the faucet off, then the water level stops increasing. If you open the drain, it starts actually falling. And that's what happens to carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So in the end, that sort of balances out this thermal inertia effect. The two things cancel. And the net effect is that when you stop emitting carbon, the surface temperatures stop warming almost immediately. And that's really important because it shows us that we have a direct impact. Our actions right now have a direct impact on the warming of the planet. And it also allows us to conclude that if we keep our carbon budget, how much carbon we burn within some budget, we can prevent the planet from warming beyond 1.5 degrees. And then finally, as you alluded to as well, we have the solutions. We don't have to rely on new technology. Now, new technology may make it easier, but we have the solutions now to decarbonize our economy. What we need is the political will to do it.
Nel suo ultimo libro, La nuova guerra del clima, si parla molto di negazionismo ma anche di inattivismo. Negli anni infatti si è passata da campagne negazioniste a campagne di quelle che lei definisce come campagne di distrazione di massa sul cambiamento climatico, ovvero appunto sono i cosiddetti inattivisti. Come funziona questa tecnica e soprattutto come possiamo difenderci come cittadini?
Yeah, so, there are potential tipping points that we worry about with climate change. The collapse of the ice sheets and the sea level rise that would cause. And again, if you live in Italy, if you've been to Venice, one of my favorite cities, you understand the consequences of sea level rise. In fact, I once gave a lecture overlooking the Grand Canal in Venice, and I was talking about sea level rise, and the audience, we were able to view the consequences because Venice has seen more and more flooding as that proceeds. And so sea level rise, there is a potential tipping point where we set in motion the partial or complete collapse of major ice sheets, of the Greenland ice sheet, of the West Antarctic ice sheet. And then we're talking not about inches or feet of sea level rise, but meters of sea level rise. There are other potential tipping points with the ocean circulation. If we melt enough ice and we dump enough fresh water into the North Atlantic Ocean, and if you've seen the movie The Day After Tomorrow, it was sort of a silly caricature of the science, but there's a grain of truth to the movie, which is that we could shut down this so-called ocean conveyor that helps deliver heat northward, for example, to Europe. And that can exhibit tipping point behavior. Once that ocean circulation pattern switches off, there's no way to bring it back. Even if we could cool the planet back down, there's no way to bring the ice sheets back once they collapse. And so these are important potential tipping points. A little bit of good news, that's the bad news. And we don't know where those tipping points lie, which is all the more reason for caution, all the more reason to take whatever actions we can to stop any further warming of the planet, because I think of it as sort of climate change is a minefield, and we're walking out onto this minefield and potentially setting off these devastating mines, and we need to avoid that. With the extreme weather events that we're talking about here, the droughts and floods and heat waves and wildfires, the good news there, if there's any good news here, is that those are tied pretty closely to the surface warming. And so if the surface of the planet stops warming up, those events stop getting worse. So we can have a direct impact there. On the other hand, we're already stuck with what we might call a new normal, which is to say, even in the best case scenario, we're stuck with this elevated risk that we're now facing. And we're going to need to adapt to that and to find ways to be resilient in the face of elevated extreme weather risk.
Ora una domanda sicuramente un po' più personale, perché lei negli anni è stato testimone di queste campagne, ha subito numerose campagne denigratorie proprio da parte di questi gruppi, campagne diffamatorie che mirano a screditare il suo lavoro, il lavoro dei colleghi. Cosa ha provato in quei momenti e come si è difeso, come ne è uscito?
Yeah, thanks very much. And there's an Italian publisher that has published the book in Italian. There's an Italian translation. I forget the title. I have it somewhere.
La nuova guerra del clima.
Yeah, thank you very much. So,
I have it here, right here.
Oh, great. And so I don't know, there's certain English expressions, I don't know how they translate in Italian. I use a term, inactivists, because an activist is somebody who's working to affect change, social change, for example. So I use the word inactivist, somebody who's working to prevent change, to prevent action. And we're talking about polluters, carbon polluters, We're talking about conservative news organizations and politicians who have really served as rubber stamps for the fossil fuel industry, who have promoted their agenda. And as you allude to, it's very difficult for the inactivists, the forces of inaction, to deny that climate change is happening anymore, because we can all see it. We can see the impacts playing out in real time. But that doesn't mean that they've given up the fight, given up the battle, or the war. They've simply shifted their tactics. So they can't credibly deny that climate change is happening. But what they've sought to do instead is engage in these other tactics in what I call the new climate war, which includes these various other words that in English begin with D. So you've got denial, but moving away from denial to delay. Promises of future action like carbon capture and sequestration or geoengineering, these techno fixes that they promise they will do at a later date as an excuse for continuing with business as usual, burning of fossil fuels today. It's a delay tactic. Another word that begins with D is division. And they have sought to divide climate advocates, get us fighting with each other online, on social media. If they can divide us, then we don't speak with a united voice demanding action. There is deflection. They want to deflect attention away from the needed solutions, systemic solutions, subsidies for renewable energy, pricing carbon, blocking new fossil fuel infrastructure, all of these things that need to happen, but we can't do these ourselves. We need our policy makers, our politicians to do that. So they've sought to deflect attention away from these needed systemic solutions and policies that will hurt their profits to individual behavior, as if it's just about you and me changing our diet or, cleaning up our bottles or what have you. It's a way to deflect attention from the real changes that are necessary. And sure, we should all do everything we can to decrease our own carbon footprint, but we should recognize that voluntary actions on our own aren't going to achieve the reductions. We need to remake the global economy into a clean energy economy. We need policies to do that. And then finally, the last word that begins with D here, doom or despair mongering. If they can convince us it's too late to do anything about the problem, ironically, it potentially leads us down the same path of inaction as outright denial. They don't care about the path we take, they just care about the destination. They want us disengaged and on the sidelines rather than being on the front lines. And so when you encounter friends, family members, coworkers, and there are many of them, good, honest, well-meaning people who have fallen into despair, who have become convinced it's too late, explain to them that it's not too late and that they've been, to some extent, they are a victim of a campaign that is intended to convince them it's too late when it's not. So as I like to say, and this is sort of my tagline from the book, there's urgency, no question about it, but there is agency. We still have the ability to make these changes.
Nell'ultimo rapporto dell'IPCC sulla mitigazione del cambiamento climatico, molta enfasi è stata data ai comportamenti individuali. Lei ne parla anche nel suo ultimo libro. Mi chiedevo, questo non potrebbe portarci ad un'ulteriore polarizzazione tra le parti, una divisione pro e contro?
Yeah, no, there were some tough moments. There's no question about it. When I was being attacked, when I, had conservative politicians who wanted to investigate me, who wanted to subject me to basically a political witch hunt, There were demands by conservative politicians for me to be fired by my university. I was presented as a villain on conservative media, television, like Fox News, presented to their viewers as a villain who was fabricating scientific evidence of climate change to get rich. And there's some irony there, of course, because we scientists aren't getting rich doing science, but the fossil fuel industry and the ones doing their bidding are getting quite rich. So there's a little bit of what you might call projection there, them accusing us of exactly what they are in fact guilty of. And so, there were death threats against me, even threats against my family. So it was a very tough time, but what I always tried to keep in perspective, and it was very useful to me to have senior colleagues who had been through these sorts of attacks themselves that I could go to for advice, who could serve as mentors and help me through all of this, like Stephen Schneider, who was a well-known climate scientist, who was one of the first climate scientists to be outspoken and to engage directly with the public. And he was a good friend of mine, and I was very saddened when he passed away a little more than a decade ago. But these friends and colleagues helped me through that, and they helped me to understand that as personal as it might have felt, it wasn't personal. It was about the fact that my science was a threat to these powerful vested interests, and they wanted to shut me up. And this is how they went about it. Ultimately, and I guess it's just the nature of my personality, it really emboldened me to play an even greater role, and to really use the platform that I had to speak out about the climate crisis. And so there are times when I jokingly thank my detractors, my attackers, because they provided me a platform that I'm now using to try to communicate this threat to the public.
Veniamo un po' all'attualità, insomma, di questi ultimi mesi. A causa della guerra in Ucraina, l'Europa sta subendo gli effetti di una grave crisi energetica, evidentemente dovuta al legame con i combustibili fossili che provengono dalla Russia. Lei crede che questa crisi possa davvero spingerci verso una transizione energetica a basse emissioni, o che invece minerà gli sforzi e gli obiettivi raggiunti finora?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really important point. The issue of lifestyle has been used as a wedge by the inactivists. It's one of the things that they do on social media. They use bots and trolls. And I'm talking, for example, about state actors, bad state actors like Russia, who have engaged in cyber warfare and have tried to interfere with other countries who've tried to pass climate legislation, because Russia's greatest asset is their fossil fuels. And Putin has fought hard to prevent climate action. And one of the things that they've done is to try to create discord and division within the community of climate advocates online. And one of the ways to do that is to get us fighting with each other over lifestyle choices, because what's more personal than your lifestyle choices? And so if you are suddenly being attacked because you're not a vegan, or because you occasionally fly to see your grandmother for the holidays, that is very polarizing. It's very, it's likely to cause you to react negatively, and it may in fact lead to even less engagement on climate. And it creates conflict within the climate movement. And so we have to be very careful. Lifestyle choice, individual action has been used as a weapon. It's been weaponized by bad actors to get us to fight with each other, meat shaming, you're a bad person because you still eat meat, that sort of polarizing language, that divisive language. the reality is, of course, we should all do everything we can to decrease our individual carbon footprint. Often the things that we do save us money. They make us healthier. They make us feel better about ourselves, and they set a good example for other people. So that's the way we should go about it. We should make the changes that we can, everybody has to operate within the constraints of their lives. But we should make the changes that we can. They set a good example for other people, but we shouldn't shame and attack other people simply because they haven't made the same choices. That will backfire. And at the same time, we have to recognize that these individual actions, while they help, what we really need are incentives, or government incentives, so that it isn't just those of us who care about climate who make climate-friendly consumer choices. Everybody makes those choices because the incentives are such that those are preferable choices for them. It shouldn't cost more money to purchase your power, your energy from renewable sources, which are better for the planet than fossil fuel sources. So we need to change that incentive structure so that everybody makes climate-friendly choices, even if they're not actively thinking about it.
Yeah,
and I think the latest report, I do think it weighs in on both aspects of the mitigation side, but it is important. It can't be one and not the other. It has to be both individual and systemic action working together.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite clear in the report. Is kind of in a scenario of different choices that, political, urban area, in the industries and civil societies have to do and can do. Absolutely, absolutely right. Let's talk about what is happening right now in these last months and in weeks in Europe due the war in Ukraine. Europe is undergoing the effects of a serious energy crisis, obviously due to the link with fossil fuels coming from Russia. And do you believe that this crisis can really push us towards a low-emission energy transition, or will instead undermine efforts and goals that we achieved so far?
Yeah, I hope it's the former and not the latter. There are two directions we could go from here. And I hope we listen to our better angels and do recognize the true message here in Russia's aggression toward Ukraine, the war that Russia is fighting against Ukraine. How did we get here? How did we build up these authoritarian states, powerful authoritarian states like Russia? It's our historical reliance on fossil fuels. Russia, Saudi Arabia, they have built their massive wealth off of our dependence on their oil and their gas. And Russia would not have, the military arsenal that they have, and they're a nuclear power as well. They wouldn't have all that if it weren't for the fact that we have propped them up for decades through our purchase of fossil fuels. It's the largest asset that Russia has, and they're trying to monetize that asset, and they're using it now as a cudgel. They're using Europe's dependence on their oil and gas as a means of preventing Europeans from taking greater sanctions against them. For example, in no longer purchasing their oil and gas. That would be a very powerful economic sanction, but European countries are averse to doing that because they're still so dependent on that oil and gas. We wouldn't be here, right? If we weren't reliant on fossil fuels, then we wouldn't be in a position where Russia could use that as leverage against us. And so this is truly a lesson in the dangers of our reliance on fossil fuels. And that's not even talking about climate change. That's simply talking about global political stability and the threat that these authoritarian petrostates now represent. So I do hope that we take away the right message. Now, you're right. You allude to the fact that in the meantime, there is a shortage of fossil fuel energy. Part of that is that the other fossil fuel companies are actually holding back. They're driving that increase in demand by not increasing supply, by not increasing production. And they're doing that deliberately to jack up prices so that they make larger profits, ExxonMobil and the other fossil fuel companies. So part of this crisis is actually driven by the fossil fuel companies in their effort to make huge profits. Yet another reason for us to move away from fossil fuel energy. So I hope that that's the message that we take away here. And yes, there are some short-term measures we might have to take, increasing production. For example, the United States is talking about tapping into their strategic reserve of fossil fuels. And in the short term, that's okay if that's what we need to do to get us there. But what we have to resist is the idea that this is a reason to double down in the long term and to increase fossil fuel infrastructure and more pipelines, more coal mines. That's exactly the wrong direction. That's the opposite of what we need to do. We need to be moving dramatically towards renewable energy because of the climate crisis and because, as we're now reminded, of the crisis in global security that we're suffering because of petrostates like Russia that we've built up through our reliance on fossil fuels.
Alla fine del 2022 ci sarà la COP27, quindi abbiamo parlato di crisi energetica, ma abbiamo anche una crisi politica che stiamo vivendo in questo momento. Cosa crede potrebbe accadere?
Yeah, well, I'm worried. I'm worried about the domestic politics in the United States. It's the worst I've ever seen. The great Carl Sagan presaged this. He spoke, with foreboding decades ago about his fear of precisely the sort of anti-science that we are now seeing. He feared sort of things like faith healing and superstition, pseudoscience. But I don't think he perceived the threat of ideologically motivated anti-science, efforts to undermine the credibility of the scientific community when it is politically expedient. And we've seen that here in the United States with climate change, of course, and we've seen it with COVID-19, where the conservatives have essentially rejected science, the advice of our public health officials. And that's literally caused hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths here in the United States. So I worry that we now live in a world, and certainly in the United States in particular, where people feel entitled to their own facts. If they don't like the facts that scientists tell them, then they simply make up their own facts. And there right now is this populist movement. Donald Trump sort of preyed upon populism and nativism and racism and misogyny. And there is this base now, this political base that's very motivated right now. They were built by, Trump and his enabling Republicans, and they represent a threat today. They, as you know, last year tried to overthrow our government, the storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2021. So it's a scary time right now. If, for example, the American people give control of Congress back to the Republicans, in the next election, I truly fear that they will undo whatever progress we've made. They will prevent the Biden administration from moving forward on climate. And without leadership from the United States, global action on climate collapses because we are the world's largest polluter. We have put more carbon pollution into the atmosphere than any other country. And if we're not willing to meet our commitments, what does that say to the rest of the world? What does it say to China and India and developing countries who rightly can argue, well, we want our turn too. You had 2 centuries of access to cheap, dirty energy to build your economy. Why shouldn't we get the same opportunity? Who are we to tell them otherwise if we're not making good on our commitments? So I do really worry about that over the next, half year. That's mostly what I'm going to be talking about here in the United States, the importance of not giving control of our government back to Republicans because it could be game over for global climate action. It really is a crisis, and it's something that we need to organize around. We need to make sure people understand the choice that they're being given in this next election because it literally is a choice between a livable future and something much worse.
Yes, thank you. But we need still have some hope. Are you agree?
I do. I think that there are some events playing out right now. Obviously, there's the Russia's attack against the Ukraine, which is changing the narrative, and to some extent it is allowing the Biden administration to demonstrate its leadership as it works with the rest of the world community in dealing with this crisis. And we have this January 6th investigation, these hearings that are going to play out over the next several months about how the Trump administration and Republicans tried to overthrow our government. And I think that as that becomes front and center, that could shift sort of the political zeitgeist, if you will, in a favorable direction. So that is, what I'm going to be working toward over the next half year is trying to make sure that Americans understand that the fate, nothing less than the fate of our planet, really lies in the balance of this next election.
Grazie professor Mann per il suo tempo e anche per le sue parole estremamente interessanti. Non mi resta che salutarvi e augurarvi buon proseguimento con il CICAP Fest.